Yo, what is going on, you guys? So today I'm bringing guys a brand new sports cards video. In today's video, we're going to be doing an experiment. We're going to be testing whether AI can predict the sports card boom and what AI thinks of the sports card market in the next 3 to 4 years. So we are on ChatGPT today, and we are going to be hopping right into this. I'm going to be giving my takes on whether I agree or disagree with what ChatGPT says about that. So without further ado, let's hop right into the video. All right, guys, so the first prompt that I put in was predict how the sports card market will do over the next few years. And it kind of gave us a cool rundown of what happened, of course, during the pandemic when we had the big rise in sports card prices from 2020 to 2021. And then, of course, there was a correction in 2022 and 2023. So, what AI predicts over the next 4 years is more gradual market growth, which does make a lot of sense. I've been talking about this for quite a while. I think it's going to be a little bit more gradual, and we've already seen more gradual increase throughout 2024 and 2025 so far. So as you guys can see, what it says is after the hype-driven surge of 2020 and 2021 and the correction that followed, the market is settling into a more sustainable phase, which I definitely see a lot of synergies with the current market sentiment. I feel like right now we're at a point where, we're not in an insanely fast growing space, but we're also not seeing any, solid declines in overall growth across markets from basketball to baseball to football. And it does predict that the all-time greats will be some of the stronger investments compared to the younger guys. So it mentions guys like LeBron, Jordan, Kobe, Mantle, and Brady, which I definitely agree with. I feel like that's an overall, we've seen solid growth in their prices since 2022 and 2023 when a lot of their markets really bottomed out. It also did mention focus on rarity and scarcity, which we've been talking about for a while. I think everyone's kind of got to that point where rarity and scarcity is becoming more and more important. Obviously, because if you look at Wemby's, pop counts right now, they're like over 24,000. So there's just a lot of, you know, overprinting, I would say, for the more common cards. So that makes a lot of sense that more demand will be focused on more rarity and scarcity, which we have seen. Another big topic was the influence of Fanatics and the overall growth of the industry in terms of Fanatics having those licenses for MLB, NBA, and NFL. And I think that definitely we've seen is reshaping the industry. I think we're getting more, of course, I would say overall advertising for the hobby, which is definitely a great sign. I think it didn't touch enough on that, but it's definitely mentioned some of it. It does say it predicts less reliance on hobby shops, which is interesting. We'll see how Fanatics kind of deals with hobby shops, but it also predicts a possible Fanatics grading service, which would be incredibly interesting. Let's see if that plays out over the next 4 years before 2028, as this predicts. But that is definitely something to think about, and I'm sure Fanatics is thinking about whether it's buying one of the grading services or coming out with their own. I think that's really interesting. And then it also does mention the young stars. So we've seen a lot of the market go towards guys like, of course, Jaden Daniels, Victor Wembanyama, Ant-Man, all of them, all the young stars, I think, have seen some great growth over the last 2 years. And I do definitely see that continuing. I don't know how many of these players will pin out to win championships and MVPs and all that, but it does predict that Stroud, Caleb Williams, and Mahomes will have strong markets. So that is interesting. It didn't have mentions of a lot of other young quarterbacks, but Mahomes for sure is a sure bet. I would say Stroud is interesting. I think he's definitely due to have a great career. And then Caleb Williams, little parentheses if he lives up to the hype, which I like. And then it also shows baseball having a resurgence. So, of course, the MLB backing Fanatics, it mentions Jackson Holiday, Ellie De La Cruz. I think a lot of this makes sense with kind of like how we're headed in terms of prospecting. I think a lot of people have been prospecting, and it's, looking at more young stars who are already in the league, which makes sense. It also does mention blockchain and NFT backed collectibles, which if I don't know if you guys have seen, but there was a super strong Caitlin Clark sale. And a lot of Panini's NFTs are actually selling for more than the physical cards, which has been super interesting. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the NFT space moving forward. And it definitely predicts fractional ownership still being something in the next 4 years, which is, I think everyone was talking a lot about fractional ownership during 2020 and 2021 when all these big fractional ownership companies came into the space. Some of them are out of business, some of them continued on. So that this could be an interesting thing to see if there's someone who's able to make fractional ownership and take their company to the next level and become one of the staple companies. This sixth one I really love because I've been talking about this for the longest time, which is international growth. For the first time in forever, we've seen so many card shows open up worldwide. I know there's one in Dubai, there's one in China, there's plenty across Europe. So I definitely see that continuing to expand. I think Fanatics has an amazing reach in terms of international, I would say audience. So that's going to be really interesting to see what happens with that. It also does mention the World Cup in North America in 2026, and of course, North America is the center for sports cards, and it's going to be interesting to see when the World Cup comes to North America, how that impacts the soccer card market, because of course, having it in the U.S., I think there's going to be a big surge in popularity next year for soccer cards and for soccer in general in the U.S. But it gives a good what to predict sentiment, which is steady, sustainable growth, Fanatics influence continuing to shape the industry, GOAT tier players continuing to go up, fractional ownership companies, modern players will be volatile, only true superstars holding long-term value. All of this makes a ton of sense. I think it's a great sentiment of where we've reached in the sports card market. So there's nothing really that I would say I disagree with on that. I did ask it which players to watch, so this is more of a specific question, seeing if it will give us any specific answers. And it did. It gave us quite a lot. So it first went for basketball, established stars, 5 of the greatest of all time. Of course, you can argue which, but I would say overall 5 of the greatest of all time. It mentioned Kevin Durant, which I thought was interesting. I think a lot of people focus on LeBron, Curry, Kobe, and MJ, but of course, KD, I think getting that mention is pretty cool. I think, it has a good sentiment because we've been having this sentiment as well recently, which is that he is a little bit underappreciated. And I think he's kind of reached a point where, because the Suns aren't winning and because he's had a rough couple past years, we've seen his market really bottom out. So I definitely agree with that. It did mention some rising stars. I thought Scoot was really interesting. Could be a buy low opportunity. I do agree with that. I think there's a lot that has to play out for that to work out, but definitely interesting that they mentioned that. Also mentioned Chet. No mention of Shea, which I thought was interesting. But I think Chet's definitely at a point where his market could go one of two ways depending on how the Thunder season end up. And then, of course, Victor Wembanyama, I think, AI is still pretty hyped on him, which I think makes a lot of sense. Some players to be cautious of. This was really interesting. Of course, Zion and Ja would be pretty expected, but Luka, I think, was an interesting one to put in this box instead of, the Rising Stars box. It says, no doubt he's elite, but his prices are already so high. Needs a ring to justify further spikes. And to be honest, I fully agree with this. I think him playing in LA could bring a new kind of like audience to his cards. Of course, I think there's going to be more collectors for the short term, but I think coming into the next couple of years, given how much of a hobby hero he's been and how much his cards have been, in the spotlight for the last literally 7 years, I think it's reaching a point where he does need a ring or an MVP or something to back it in the coming years, or we could see his prices, start to settle down a little bit. But it moved on to NFL. 4 guys that you can't really go wrong with: Mahomes, Brady, Burrow, Allen. Those are the safe bets. I definitely agree. I would say for Josh Allen and Joe Burrow, I'm a little bit more skeptical of. I would put them more in the little bit risky because they're getting a little bit older and it's coming to a point where they've got to win MVPs, they've got to win Super Bowls, or I think their cards are going to have a little bit of a decline. So that's interesting. I would definitely say that Mahomes and Brady, super safe bets. I would just say for Burrow and Allen, it's like the window's closing a little bit. That would be the one place I disagree with. Now, of course, you've got a couple rising stars on here. You got Caleb Williams, you got Brock Purdy. It looks like this might be a little bit behind because it's saying incoming rookie for Caleb Williams. But Stroud's on there, Anthony Richardson's on there. Buy low opportunity for Richardson. Alt agrees with that. His cards are up over 20% over the last 90 days, according to Alt. So, people are coming around to Richardson. He had a decent year. And then, of course, Brock Purdy, can't really go wrong. I think it's going to be an interesting next couple years for the Niners. But overall, I think, he's a decent bet to take a bet on. CJ Stroud, I think his buy low opportunity could be interesting. And then players to be cautious of. It looks like this is a little bit outdated because they got Jalen Hurts on here. I would say this has changed, but for T-Law, I would definitely agree with T-Law. For players to be cautious of, honestly, I would probably throw Caleb Williams in there. I think his market is obviously going to start off super high, and I think it's going to depend on how the Bears are really able to shape in the next couple of years. But I think more of the demand is going to go towards Jaden Daniels, even Bo Nix, Drake May. I think, are going to have a little bit more, I wouldn't say more demand, but I'd say, I think a lot of eyes are on them as well. So I think Caleb is somebody who I think is coming out a little bit strong just because his market's so much higher than them. So it's going to be interesting to see where that plays out. Herbert was interesting. I think he's also been like a hobby hero. He's kind of like the Luka of the NFL, in my opinion, in terms of sports card correlations. I think for him, he needs to start winning. I don't see it happening soon, which scares me a little bit. I think there's going to continue to be a softening in Herbert's market for the next couple years. So I would definitely be a little bit cautious of Herbert. And T-Law, of course, I think at this point, it's kind of getting to a place where he hasn't really taken that next step and people are getting a little bit cautious of him. For baseball, definitely makes sense. So you got Shohei, Acuna, and Betts. Can't really go wrong. I pretty much fully agree with this. You got the rising stars, Ellie, Holiday, Dominguez, Carroll, interesting. And then to be cautious of, I think these two are pretty interesting. Juan Soto and Tatis, two of my personal favorite players. I think it's an interesting time for both of their markets. Of course, Soto, I think is going to be a hot name all summer. I think Tatis as well will be a hot name all summer. I'm personally not as cautious as AI on these two. I think they'll be fine for the long term, but it's going to be interesting. I think they do need to have a big year next year. Moving on to soccer, this was one of the more high potential growth, factors that ChatGPT went with. And that is, of course, Messi, Ronaldo, and Mbappe being the top three. I think that's very, very, hard to disagree with. They're all blue chip investments. They're all faces of soccer. So if the soccer market goes up in 2026, these three will 100% be the three names that I think will be part of what leads that. And then you got Jude Bellingham. You got Haaland for rising stars. I like these three overall. I think there's going to be a lot of demand, for the World Cup for these three. What I thought was interesting was Pulisic. Now, Christian, I think, has been obviously the U.S.'s hero. I think a lot of his hype will be there just because the U.S. is hosting and the U.S. is the biggest market for sports cards. So I think he's going to have a ton of collectors. I just think it's going to be risky when you get to that tournament. If they do get knocked out early, I think we're going to see a big dip in his prices. But at the same time, if they make it far, you could see a big increase. So I think I would definitely be cautious, but I think it could also be a play leading into the World Cup, maybe selling right before the World Cup when, prices are at a peak, when all the hype is there for the U.S. to be hosting. But overall, I really agree with, 95% of what ChatGPT had to say about the sports card market. Moving forward, it said, modern prospects are risky, vintage walls be stable, Fanatics will change the landscape, international markets will grow. And that's the main thing for soccer. I think soccer is honestly the best opportunity for the next 4 years, just based on the fact that the U.S. is getting the World Cup and Fanatics and more shows are popping up in Europe. And these shows are mainly focused on soccer. So if you get more and more shows in Europe, if sports cards grow in Europe, if Fanatics is able to bring sports cards to Europe more, I think it's going to be super interesting. They did mention potentially some more international shows. So if Fanatics does end up taking more shows international, soccer is the biggest sport. And I think soccer is going to have a great run up in prices between that factor and the US hosting the World Cup. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed, make sure to drop a like and subscribe. We are on our way to 60,000 subscribers. But other than that, I hope you all enjoyed, and I'm out.